When rock and roll arrived with 1954's Rock Around the Clock, radio stations would not play rock music, reasons being the lyrics rang rebellion and defiance, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. The message was as appalling to the older generation as the music's harder driving beat and louder wailing saxophones and guitars. This dissertation is being made in response to a request from high school students doing a research project on rock and roll on the radio. The student's instructor is the California History Teacher of the Year, who also happens to be my niece. This is mentioned because her dad, my older brother, was very instrumental in influencing my career as a rock and roll disc jockey. I was 10 years old when rock and roll arrived on the radio. The first rock and roll songs I remember hearing were Rock Around the Clock and Elvis's Hound Dog and Heartbreak Hotel. My only reaction was thinking my older sister was kind of silly in idolizing Elvis. My parents' reaction to rock and roll? My dad did not particularly like it. My mom was okay with it, mainly because her daughter and oldest son, my brother, really liked it. Our family went to the home of friends to watch the Ed Sullivan Show on TV in September of 1956 when Elvis first performed. I remember my dad was not too crazy about all the fuss Elvis was creating. Who were my favorite artists early on? Paul Anka, drummer Sandy Nelson, guitarist Duane Eddy. The first 45 I bought was Paul Anka's Lonely Boy in 1959. I learned my rock drumming from Sandy Nelson albums. The first album I bought was a Duane Eddy LP. I began DJing at age 14 in 1960 at a radio station in rural Nebraska, a station whose format was country and western and MOR, middle of the road. A disc jockey back then typically had a nickname and a theme song. My brother suggested I become the Rockin' Rebel Rouser of KBRX radio, and my theme would be the Duane Eddy twangy guitar instrumental, Rebel Rouser. By the early 60s, MOR stations had begun programming pop music in the afternoon to appeal to the younger audience, which had become the majority of record buyers based on sales of 45 records. I got to play mild rock hits on my Top 30 Countdown show, the Top 30 determined by Cashbox magazine. I might have to substitute a more mellow hit if a hard-driving rhythm and blues rock song made the charts, but that never posed a problem for me. I could play Elvis's Hound Dog if I wanted, although the station manager preferred more mellow Elvis oldies. When it came to oldies, though, Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, and Little Richard were strictly off limits. I never knew who Alan Freed was, even during my teenage disc jockey tenure. Alan Freed's radio career had ended by 1960. He died in 1964. He had not impacted my radio career personally. I was told of payola when I began radio in 1960, but no mention was made of Alan Freed. I do agree that he helped break down racial barriers in American pop culture in the 1950s by leading white and black youngsters to listen to the same music. I never really learned about Alan Freed until the 1978 movie American Hot Wax told his story. My most confrontational and frustrating situations came while DJing on Apple Valley's KAVR radio in the 1970s. The program director was retired military Air Force who disdained anything rock played on the station's MOR format. He went so far as to disallow anything by Simon and Garfunkel because he thought Garfunkel sounded too much like a vulgar word. When a new album arrived, he would listen to all the songs and he would take an orange crayon and mark through the grooves on any track he did not want played. I had brought a number of my own 45s to play on my weekday afternoon show since KAVR's Oldies library lacked any Buddy Holly or Roy Orbison or British Invasion records, far less Chuck Berry or Marvin Gaye. On weekends, if I slipped in That'll Be the Day, or Oh Pretty Woman, or a Beatles' She Loves You, or I Want to Hold Your Hand, I was sure to be reprimanded. To ensure my oldies 45s would not be heard on KAVR, the program director removed them from my personal stack of records and gave them to an Air Force DJ who played music for the base's dances. Well, the program director didn't know I was friends with that DJ, who called to thank me for donating my 45s to him. I immediately retrieved the 45s and took delight in sneaking one or two back into my show, leaving the program director mystified and befuddled as to how I got those classic rock hits back. This was 1971. At the time, Nilsson was coming off his hits, Everybody's Talking, and the number one hit, I Can't Live If Living Is Without You. The eccentric Nilsson released an album entitled Nilsson Schmilsson, which I had been given a couple of promotional copies when I made my regular run down to RCA Victor Records in Los Angeles. When I listened to the Schmilsson LP, the last song on side one caught my attention. You're Breaking My Heart was the title. It became notorious for its opening line, You're breaking my heart, you're tearing it apart, so F you. The F word, the vulgar one, that sounded too much like Garfunkel to our program director. So I left a copy of the LP on the program director's desk with the note, Give a listen to Cut 5, Side 1. It summarizes your preference in songs we can play. Back in those days, even AM top 40 stations shied away from anything too hard because their sponsors did not want listeners hearing anything offensive. Plus, the Federal Communications Commission banned a radio station from airing any programming it deemed indecent or unsuited for children to hear. Even a folk song by the Kingston Trio had to muffle their lyric, I don't give a damn about a greenback dollar, by striking a loud chord where damn was to be heard. Tony Orlando and Dawn hit number one with Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree in 1973. That was the first song AM stations were allowed to play using the word damn. The whole damn bus was cheering. FM radio became the refuge for harder rock and heavy metal enthusiasts because FM then was commercial-free. Longer versions of songs by Led Zeppelin, The Who, Jethro Tull, the Allman Brothers ruled the FM airwaves in those early days. Speaking of the FCC, an on-the-air announcer or DJ had to pass a written test to receive a radio operator's license, much the same as a pilot had to pass a Federal Aviation Administration test to qualify to fly. Radio stations were subject to unannounced inspections by an FCC official who had monitored your programming before entering the studio. Then the first thing the official did was check to see if the announcer had a license, to inspect the program logs to see if commercials matched up to what he had heard, and then inspect your meter readings log. Meter readings had to be entered every half hour to ensure the station was not broadcasting with more power than it was licensed for. It was not until 1991 that the Supreme Court ruled the FCC ban on radio programming was unconstitutional, that it violated freedom of speech. By that time, radio, television, and the motion picture industry had long since desensitized the American public to what had earlier been considered indecent, vulgar, or material unsuitable for young audiences. So, there you have it. Recollections and reflections that for me will live forever. An assertion that rock and roll will never die.